Subscribe to the channel for more stories. My name is Sarah. I'm 28 years old, and what I'm about to tell you will change everything you think you know about success, failure, and the price of proving everyone wrong. I need to get this off my chest before it destroys me completely, because the weight of this secret has been crushing my soul for months now. They laughed when I said I'd be someone. Every single person in that cramped apartment, every face in that circle of friends, every voice that echoed through those thin walls that night 3 years ago. But they're not laughing now, and honestly, I'm not sure if that's a victory or the beginning of my greatest nightmare. You see, success isn't what they show you in movies or what you read about in those glossy magazines. It's not champagne celebrations or red carpet moments. Real success, the kind that comes from absolute desperation and burning rage, tastes like blood in your mouth and feels like your heart being ripped apart every single day. And the worst part, once you get there, once you finally prove them all wrong, you realize the person you became along the way is someone you don't even recognize anymore. That night started like any other. Friday evening, in my pathetic excuse for a life. I was 25, working double shifts at a diner that smelled like grease and broken dreams. Living in a studio apartment where the walls were so thin I could hear my neighbor's every breath. My bank account had exactly $47. My car had been repossessed 2 weeks earlier, and I hadn't bought new clothes in 8 months. But what happened that evening? What they said to me, what they did to my dreams and my dignity, that changed everything. I still remember the taste of cheap wine on my tongue, the sound of their laughter cutting through my soul like broken glass, and the moment I decided I would rather die than live another day as their source of entertainment. The gathering was supposed to be casual, just old college friends catching up, sharing stories about our lives, our careers, our accomplishments. Everyone else had something to brag about. Jessica had just gotten promoted to marketing director at some fancy firm downtown. Mike had bought his second rental property. Even quiet little Amy had started her own successful blog that was making 5 figures a month. And then there was me, Sarah the waitress, Sarah the dreamer, Sarah the girl who still believed she could make it big despite having absolutely nothing to show for her 25 years on this planet, except a collection of rejection letters and a growing pile of unpaid bills. When they asked what I was up to, I should have lied. I should have made up some story about progress, about opportunities, about anything other than the truth. But something inside me, some desperate need to hold on to the last shred of hope I had left, made me tell them about my plan, my beautiful, naive, absolutely insane plan to become a successful entrepreneur. I told them about the business idea I'd been developing for months, working on it every spare moment between shifts, staying up until 3 in the morning researching, planning, dreaming. It was an online platform connecting local artisans with customers who wanted authentic, handmade products. I had it all figured out, the marketing strategy, the revenue model, even the name, Artisan Connect. The silence that followed my explanation was deafening. Then Mike started chuckling, a low, condescending sound that made my stomach turn. Jessica joined in, covering her mouth with her manicured hand like she was trying to be polite, while simultaneously crushing my soul. Amy just stared at me with a mixture of pity and embarrassment, like I had just announced I was planning to become a unicorn trainer. But what happened next shattered something fundamental inside me, something that I'm not sure ever fully healed. What they said, how they looked at me, the way they dismissed not just my idea but my entire existence as if I was some kind of pathetic joke. I still can't think about it without feeling that same burning rage building in my chest, that same desperate need to prove them wrong that would eventually consume everything good left in my life. The laughter grew louder, more vicious, and I realized this wasn't just friendly teasing. This was the sound of people who had written me off completely, who saw me as entertainment, as a cautionary tale, as living proof of what happens when you dream too big without the talent or resources to back it up. But they had no idea what they had just unleashed. They had no clue that their laughter would become the fuel for a transformation so complete, so devastating, that it would change not just my life but theirs as well. What I discovered about myself in the months that followed, what I was capable of when pushed to the absolute breaking point, it terrifies me even now, because success, real success, requires sacrifice. And sometimes, the price you pay for proving everyone wrong is so high that victory feels exactly like defeat. What I'm about to tell you about what happened next about how I went from being their laughingstock to being someone they now fear. It's something I've never shared with anyone before. And after tonight, after I tell you everything, I'm not sure I'll ever be the same again. The weight of what I've done, the person I've become, the lives I've destroyed in my quest to prove them wrong, it's eating me alive from the inside out. But I need you to understand. I need someone to know the whole truth before it's too late. What happened that night was just the beginning. The real story, the one that will haunt me forever, starts with what I did the very next morning when I woke up with tears dried on my cheeks and murder in my heart. Asterisk, asterisk, I woke up the next morning with something I'd never felt before burning in my chest. A rage so pure and focused it felt like swallowing liquid fire. My face was still puffy from crying myself to sleep, but my tears had crystallized into something much more dangerous, absolute determination, mixed with a thirst for revenge that scared even me. But what I discovered that morning, what I found hidden in my laptop's browser history from months of late-night research, would become the foundation for everything that followed. I had been building something without even realizing it, collecting pieces of a puzzle that would eventually destroy everyone who had laughed at me. The first thing I did was quit my job at the diner. I walked in at 6 a.m., found my manager counting the register, and told him I was done. He laughed, said I'd be back within a week, begging for my job back. Just like all the other dreamers who thought they were too good for honest work. His laughter joined the chorus in my head, the soundtrack of mockery that would drive me for the next 3 years. I had saved exactly $3,000 over 2 years of working double shifts and eating ramen noodles for dinner. It wasn't much, but it was everything I had. And I was about to bet it all on a plan so crazy, so desperate, that even I wasn't sure it would work. But desperation makes you creative in ways comfort never could. And I was about to discover talents I never knew I possessed. The business idea they had laughed at, Artisan Connect, was just the surface. Underneath, I had been developing something much more sophisticated. A network of connections and opportunities that I hadn't even fully understood until that morning when rage gave me perfect clarity. I had been documenting every local artisan, every small business owner, every frustrated creator who felt overlooked by the mainstream market, but what they didn't know, what I had kept hidden even from myself, was that I had also been studying them. During all those college gatherings, all those casual conversations, I had been unconsciously cataloging their weaknesses, their insecurities, their secret fears and desires, information that would prove invaluable in the months to come. I spent the entire weekend in my apartment, surviving on coffee and adrenaline, building what would become the foundation of my empire. But this wasn't just about creating a successful business anymore. This was about psychological warfare, about understanding exactly what made each of them tick. What would hurt them most when I finally had the power to hurt them back? Jessica, the marketing director with her perfect Instagram life, was terrified of being exposed as a fraud. I had noticed how she always steered conversations away from specific details about her work, how she used buzzwords to mask her lack of real expertise. Mike, the real estate investor, was leveraging himself to the breaking point, using credit and borrowed money to maintain an image of success that was built on the thinnest foundation. Amy's blog success was entirely dependent on a algorithm that could change overnight. But what I discovered about myself during those first few weeks of building Artisan Connect was far more disturbing than anything I learned about them. I found that I had a natural talent for manipulation, for understanding people's deepest motivations and using that knowledge to get exactly what I wanted. It was like discovering I had a superpower I never knew existed. The platform launched 6 weeks after that horrible night, and within the first month, I had signed up over 200 local artisans and generated $15,000 in sales. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the phone call I received from a local newspaper wanting to do a feature story about innovative young entrepreneurs in the city. When that article came out, when my photo appeared on the front page of the business section with the headline, "Local Waitress Builds Successful Online Empire," I felt something I had never experienced before. It wasn't just satisfaction or pride. It was the intoxicating taste of revenge. And I wanted more of it. I needed more of it. The first person to reach out after the article was published was Amy. She sent a text message that tried to sound casual, congratulating me on my success, suggesting we should catch up soon. But I could read between the lines. She was worried. She had realized that maybe they had been wrong about me, and she was trying to get back on my good side before it was too late. I ignored her message. I ignored all of their messages, because what I was planning next would require complete focus, and I couldn't afford to be distracted by their pathetic attempts at damage control. They had laughed when I said I'd be someone, and now I was going to show them exactly what kind of someone I could become. The platform was just the beginning. Using the connections I had built, the trust I had earned from the artisan community, I started expanding into other areas. I launched a consulting service for small businesses, then a digital marketing agency, then an investment fund focused on local startups. Each success built on the previous one, creating a snowball effect that even I hadn't anticipated. But success wasn't changing me the way I thought it would. Instead of feeling fulfilled or happy, I felt empty, like I was becoming someone else entirely. Someone harder, colder, more calculating. Someone who could look at another person and immediately see their weaknesses, see exactly how to destroy them if necessary. The money started flowing in faster than I could count it. 20,000 a month, then 50, then 6 figures. I moved out of my studio apartment into a luxury downtown loft. I bought clothes that cost more than I used to make in a month. I surrounded myself with the trappings of success. But something fundamental was wrong. Every victory felt hollow because it wasn't enough. No amount of success could erase the memory of their laughter, could heal the wound they had carved into my soul that night. I needed them to suffer the way I had suffered. I needed them to feel the humiliation, the crushing weight of failure, the desperate loneliness of being dismissed by everyone who was supposed to care about you. And that's when I realized that destroying them wouldn't be enough either. I needed to become someone so successful, so powerful, so intimidating that they would spend the rest of their lives regretting the moment they decided to laugh at my dreams. I needed to become their worst nightmare. What I did next, the plan I developed to systematically dismantle their lives while building my empire, it crossed lines that I can never uncross. But in that moment, consumed by rage and drunk on my growing power, it felt like justice. It felt like exactly what they deserved. The transformation was complete. I was no longer Sarah the dreamer, Sarah the waitress, Sarah the girl they could laugh at and dismiss. I had become something else entirely, something that would haunt their dreams and destroy their peace of mind forever. But I still had no idea what that transformation would ultimately cost me, or how far I would be willing to go to prove that I was someone worth fearing. 6 months after launching Artisan Connect, I was making more money than all of them combined, but that wasn't enough anymore. Money was just a tool, a weapon I could use to achieve my real goal, making them understand that laughing at me was the biggest mistake they had ever made in their pathetic lives. But what I discovered during those months of rapid success terrified me more than their laughter ever had. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone who could calculate the exact amount of pressure needed to destroy another person's life without feeling even a flicker of remorse. The sweet, naive girl who had once dreamed of helping artisans connect with customers was dying, replaced by something much more dangerous. That I started with Jessica because her success was the most fragile, built on lies and borrowed expertise that wouldn't withstand serious scrutiny. I had done my research, and I knew exactly where she was vulnerable. Her marketing campaigns were generic, ineffective, and most importantly, overpriced. Her clients were starting to notice, and she was desperately trying to cover her inadequacies with more aggressive self-promotion. Using my network of small business owners, I started spreading the word about Jessica's failures. Not directly, never directly. I was much smarter than that. I would casually mention to clients how disappointed they seemed with their current marketing results, then suggest they might want to explore other options. I would share examples of successful campaigns that were the opposite of everything Jessica was doing, making sure the comparison was impossible to miss. Within 3 months, Jessica lost 4 major clients. Her confidence started cracking, and that crack became visible in everything she did. Her social media posts became more desperate, more obviously fabricated. Her networking events turned into painful performances where everyone could see she was falling apart, but no one wanted to get close enough to help. But watching her suffer wasn't giving me the satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, it felt like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Each of her failures reminded me of my own pain, my own humiliation, my own desperate need for validation that was turning me into a monster. Mike was next because his real estate empire was even more fragile than Jessica's marketing facade. He was using dangerous amounts of leverage, borrowing against properties to buy more properties, creating a house of cards that would collapse the moment interest rates shifted or the market corrected. All I had to do was wait for the right moment and then give it a gentle push. I started building relationships with his lenders, his investors, his property management companies, not to sabotage him directly, but to position myself as an alternative. When things inevitably went wrong, I offered better terms, more reliable service, more personal attention. I was building a network that would naturally redirect business away from Mike's over-leveraged operation. The beautiful thing about Mike's destruction was that he did most of the work himself. His greed, his need to appear more successful than he actually was, made him take increasingly dangerous risks. When the market shifted and 3 of his properties became vacant simultaneously, he couldn't cover the mortgage payments. When his primary lender called in a loan early due to covenant violations, he didn't have the liquidity to respond. I was there when his empire collapsed, ready to buy his best properties at auction for pennies on the dollar. The look in his eyes when he realized I was the one acquiring his life's work, when he understood that his failure was feeding my success. It was everything I had dreamed about during those long nights of rage and planning. But victory tasted like ashes in my mouth. Destroying Mike should have felt like justice, like closing a chapter on my humiliation and moving forward as a winner. Instead, it felt like I was drowning in the same poison that was killing him. His pain didn't erase my pain. It just created more pain, more emptiness, more desperate need for something that would never come. Amy was the most complicated because her success was real, built on genuine talent and hard work. Her blog had grown into a media company with multiple revenue streams and a loyal audience. She hadn't just gotten lucky, she had actually earned her success, which made destroying her feel more like murder than justice. But by then, I was too far gone to stop. The machine I had built for revenge was running on its own momentum, and Amy's genuine success made her an even more attractive target. If I could destroy someone who actually deserved their achievements, it would prove that I was more powerful than merit, more dangerous than talent, more ruthless than anyone who had ever underestimated me. I studied her business model for weeks, identifying every dependency, every vulnerability, every single point of failure. Her audience loved her because she seemed authentic, relatable, like a friend who happened to have great advice about lifestyle and personal development. That authenticity was her greatest strength, but it was also her greatest weakness. I created a competing platform, using everything I had learned about building audiences and generating engagement. But instead of trying to outperform Amy directly, I started undermining the foundation of her success. I hired writers to create similar content, then launched it through multiple channels to make it seem like Amy's ideas weren't original. I funded criticism of her products, her methods, her authenticity. The most devastating attack came when I discovered that Amy had been struggling with depression for years, something she had hidden from her audience to maintain her image as someone who had life figured out. Using my network of contacts, I made sure that information found its way to gossip blogs and industry publications, not as a direct leak, but as a pattern of hints and suggestions that created doubt about her credibility. Watching Amy's empire crumble was like watching someone die slowly. Her audience started questioning everything she had ever said, every piece of advice she had given, every product she had recommended. The comments on her posts turned vicious, filled with people who felt betrayed by learning about her private struggles. Her business partners started distancing themselves, afraid that association with her would damage their own reputations. But, as Amy's success turned to ashes, as I absorbed her audience and her business partners and her market position, I realized that I had become something unspeakable. I wasn't just successful anymore. I was a destroyer of lives, a predator who fed on other people's dreams and achievements. The girl who had once wanted to help artisans connect with customers had become someone who would destroy an innocent person's life just to prove a point about power and revenge. And the worst part was that none of it was enough. Destroying all 3 of them, absorbing their businesses, proving my superiority in every measurable way, it hadn't healed the wound they had created that night. If anything, it had made the emptiness worse, like cutting deeper into an infected wound instead of cleaning it properly. I was rich, powerful, feared, and respected, but I was also completely alone, and what I was about to discover about the true cost of my revenge would make me question whether proving them wrong had been worth destroying my soul. 2 years after I had systematically destroyed their lives, I was worth over $10 million and controlled a business empire that spanned multiple industries. I had proven that I was someone powerful enough to crush anyone who dared to underestimate me. But what I hadn't anticipated was how completely empty that victory would feel, or how the person I had become in pursuit of revenge would be someone I could barely stand to live with. The success was real, undeniable, and terrifying in its scope. Artisan Connect had evolved into a comprehensive platform that controlled over 60% of the local handmade goods market. My consulting business was working with Fortune 500 companies. My investment fund had generated returns that made me a legend in local business circles. On paper, I was everything I had dreamed of becoming, and more. But what happened next? What I discovered about the true price of my transformation would shake me to my core and force me to confront the monster I had created in my desperate quest to prove them wrong. The first crack in my perfect revenge fantasy appeared when I saw Jessica at a coffee shop downtown. 18 months after her business had collapsed, she was sitting alone at a corner table, wearing clothes that were clearly secondhand, staring at a laptop screen with the kind of desperate focus I remembered from my own darkest days. For a moment, looking at her, I saw myself 3 years earlier, broken, desperate, but still fighting. She looked up and saw me watching her. Instead of anger or hatred, her expression showed something much worse, pity. She felt sorry for me. This woman whose life I had systematically destroyed was looking at me with compassion, like I was the one who needed help. That look hit me harder than any insult or mockery ever could have. I approached her table, expecting her to lash out, to confront me about what I had done, to give me the satisfaction of her anger and pain. Instead, she smiled sadly and asked if I wanted to sit down. She offered to buy me coffee, even though it was obvious she could barely afford her own. The generosity of someone I had destroyed was more devastating than all their laughter had ever been. We talked for 2 hours, and Jessica told me about the depression she had fallen into after losing her business, the therapy she was going through, the part-time job she had taken at a nonprofit to pay her bills while she figured out her next steps. But what destroyed me was her genuine concern for my well-being. She asked if I was happy, if all my success was bringing me joy, if I had found what I was looking for. I lied and told her I was living my best life, that everything was perfect, that success was everything I had dreamed it would be. But she saw through me immediately, the way you can only see through someone when you've been in the same dark place they're trying to hide. She told me that revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but it never actually heals the original wounds. It just creates new wounds that hurt in different ways. Walking away from that conversation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine remorse. Not regret about getting caught or fear of consequences, but actual sorrow for the pain I had caused to someone who didn't deserve it. Jessica's business had been failing even before I intervened. Her methods were genuinely flawed, but I had accelerated her downfall and made sure she suffered more than necessary. I had turned her manageable failure into a devastating collapse, just to feed my own ego. But what happened next forced me to confront the full scope of what I had become, and what my quest for revenge had cost, not just them, but everyone around me. Mike's story was even worse. His real estate collapse had triggered a chain reaction that destroyed not just his own life, but the lives of his investors, his employees, and the tenants who had trusted him with their homes. 3 families had been evicted when he couldn't maintain the properties properly. 2 elderly investors had lost their retirement savings. His assistant had been hospitalized for stress-related health problems when the business imploded. I learned all this from a private investigator I had hired to track the aftermath of my revenge, partly to ensure they weren't rebuilding their lives too quickly, partly to feed my addiction to their suffering. The report detailed the collateral damage of Mike's failure, the innocent people who had been hurt by my carefully orchestrated destruction of his over-leveraged empire. Mike himself had moved back in with his parents at age 32, was working at a hardware store for minimum wage, and had declared bankruptcy. His marriage had ended when his wife realized the full extent of their financial disaster. He was attending debt counseling and Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, trying to rebuild himself from nothing while dealing with creditors and legal challenges that would follow him for years. But the most devastating revelation in that report was about Amy. Her story wasn't just about business failure or financial loss. It was about something much more fundamental, something that made me realize I had crossed a line from revenge into genuine evil. After her platform collapsed and her audience turned against her, Amy had attempted suicide. She had been hospitalized for 3 weeks, had lost custody of her young daughter temporarily while she underwent intensive psychiatric treatment, and was now living in a supervised facility while slowly rebuilding her mental health. The depression I had weaponized against her had nearly killed her, and the business failure I had orchestrated had almost destroyed her family. Reading that report, understanding the full scope of what my revenge had caused, I felt something break inside me that I knew would never heal. I had become a monster, someone who destroyed innocent lives just to prove a point about my own worth. The laughter that had wounded me so deeply 3 years earlier was nothing compared to the damage I had inflicted in response. That night, alone in my luxury apartment surrounded by all the symbols of my success, I understood for the first time what I had actually accomplished. I had proven that I could be someone, but the someone I had become was a person I despised more than I had ever despised them. I had won the war but lost my soul, and no amount of money or power could change that fundamental truth. But what I was about to discover about the people I had been trying so hard to impress, about the night that had started this whole cycle of revenge, would force me to question everything I thought I knew about what had actually happened and why I had dedicated my life to destroying people who might not have deserved it. The truth about that night, about what I had misunderstood and misremembered in my rage and pain, was waiting for me in a phone call that would shatter every assumption I had built my empire of revenge upon. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening exactly 3 years after that night when they had laughed at my dreams. I was working late in my office, reviewing acquisition proposals and planning my next business expansion, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Something made me answer it instead of letting it go to voicemail, and that decision changed everything I thought I knew about my story. It was Amy's voice, but not the confident, successful Amy from 3 years ago, or even the broken Amy from the investigator's report. This was someone who sounded like she had been to hell and back. Someone who had survived something terrible and come out the other side fundamentally changed. She was calling from the psychiatric facility, and she wanted to meet with me, not to apologize, not to beg for mercy, but to tell me something about that night that I needed to hear. The meeting took place at a small park near the facility, a neutral location where Amy felt safe and I could maintain the illusion that I was still in control of the situation. But the moment I saw her, I knew that whatever power dynamic I thought existed between us had shifted completely. She looked fragile but not broken, damaged but somehow stronger, like someone who had lost everything and discovered that losing everything wasn't the end of the world. What she told me in that conversation destroyed every foundation I had built, my revenge upon every justification I had used to rationalize destroying their lives, every assumption about that night that had fueled 3 years of systematic cruelty. The truth was so different from what I had believed that it made me question not just my actions, but my entire understanding of reality. That night when they had laughed at my business idea, when I had felt so humiliated and dismissed, Amy told me what had actually been happening from their perspective. They weren't laughing at me, or my dreams, or my determination to succeed. They were laughing because they recognized something in my presentation that I had been completely unaware of, something that made my business plan seem impossible not because it was stupid, but because it already existed. Jessica had been working on an almost identical platform for her marketing clients. Mike had been investing in local artisan businesses through his real estate connections. Amy had been featuring handmade goods on her blog and had been planning to launch a marketplace section. My idea wasn't original or groundbreaking. It was something all of them were already doing in different ways, and they were laughing at the coincidence, at how funny it was that we were all thinking along the same lines. But what made their laughter even more painful to understand in retrospect was what Amy told me about their conversation after I had left that night. They hadn't been mocking me or my abilities. They had been worried about me. They could see that I was struggling financially, that I was putting all my hope into this one idea, that I was emotionally fragile in a way that made them concerned about how I would handle the inevitable challenges of entrepreneurship. Jessica had wanted to offer me a job at her marketing firm, Mike had been planning to introduce me to some investors who specialized in helping women start businesses. Amy had been thinking about featuring my story on her blog as an inspirational piece about following your dreams despite obstacles. They were laughing because they were excited about helping me, because they saw potential in me that I couldn't see in myself. But my reaction that night, the way I had stormed out in anger and humiliation, had made them think I wasn't ready for honest feedback or collaborative support. They had respected my obvious need for space and independence, assuming I would reach out when I was ready to accept help. They had been waiting for me to contact them, not because they wanted to gloat about my struggles, but because they wanted to be there when I was ready to accept their support. Learning this truth felt like being turned inside out, like discovering that everything I thought was real had been a hallucination born from my own insecurity and desperation. I had built an empire of revenge based on a complete misunderstanding, had destroyed innocent lives because I was too proud and too damaged to recognize genuine concern when I saw it. But what Amy told me next was even more devastating than learning about my misperception of that night. She told me about the investigation she had conducted into my business practices, the pattern of targeted attacks she had uncovered, the systematic way I had undermined each of their careers while building my own success. She had evidence, documentation, witness statements. She knew exactly what I had done and how I had done it. More importantly, she knew why I had done it. She understood that my actions came from a place of deep pain and misunderstanding, that I had been operating from a wound that had never properly healed. But understanding my motivation didn't excuse the damage I had caused, the lives I had destroyed, the innocent people who had suffered because of my need for revenge against a betrayal that had never actually happened. Amy told me that she could destroy me completely with what she knew. She could expose my business practices, ruin my reputation, trigger investigations that would unravel everything I had built. She could give me a taste of the same medicine I had forced them to swallow, could make me experience the same devastation I had orchestrated for them. But she wasn't going to do that. Instead, she was giving me a choice, an opportunity to make things right before it was too late to salvage anything worthwhile from the wreckage of my revenge. She was offering me the chance to become someone worth being, instead of someone worth fearing. The choice she presented was simple but terrifying. I could continue down the path I was on, building my empire on the bones of other people's dreams, living with the knowledge that my success was built on cruelty and misunderstanding, or I could acknowledge what I had done, take responsibility for the damage I had caused, and use my resources and power to help rebuild the lives I had destroyed. But what she didn't tell me, what I would only discover later, was that this choice came with a deadline. Amy wasn't the only one who knew about my business practices, and she wasn't the only one who had been investigating my systematic destruction of their lives. What I had built through revenge was about to collapse in ways I never could have anticipated, and the empire I had created would become the instrument of my own destruction. The truth about that night had shattered my justifications for revenge, but it was too late to undo what I had done. The monster I had become couldn't be easily tamed, and the systems I had created for destroying others were about to turn their attention to destroying me. Asterisks walking away from that conversation with Amy, I felt like my entire reality had shifted. Beneath my feet, everything I had believed about myself, about them, about the night that had changed my life, was built on a foundation of misunderstanding and wounded pride. But understanding the truth didn't automatically erase 3 years of systematic cruelty, and I was about to discover that some actions create consequences that can't be undone no matter how sincere your remorse. The first sign that my empire was built on quicksand came when I tried to reach out to Jessica with an apology and an offer to help rebuild her career. I called her, sent emails, even showed up at the nonprofit where she worked part-time, desperately trying to explain what I had learned about that night and how sorry I was for misunderstanding their intentions. But Jessica wouldn't see me, wouldn't take my calls, wouldn't even acknowledge my attempts at contact. Her response came through her lawyer instead. A cease and desist letter that made it clear she wanted no contact with me whatsoever. The letter referenced specific instances of business interference, documented cases where my actions had directly contributed to her professional failures, and made it obvious that she knew exactly what I had done even if she couldn't prove it. In court, my attempts at apology were being interpreted as harassment, and my desire to make amends was being seen as another form of manipulation. But what truly terrified me was the investigation that letter referenced. An ongoing inquiry into my business practices that Jessica had apparently been cooperating with for months. Someone with serious resources and legal authority was looking into how I had built my success, and they were finding patterns that could destroy everything I had accomplished. The investigation had started with Mike's bankruptcy case, when his lawyers had noticed unusual patterns in how his business had collapsed. Properties that should have been profitable had mysteriously lost tenants just before I acquired them at auction. Lenders who had been happy with Mike's payments had suddenly called in loans after receiving information about his financial situation that wasn't publicly available. Business partners had terminated contracts based on rumors that seemed to originate from sources connected to my network. What made the investigation particularly dangerous was that it wasn't just looking at what I had done to them, but at the broader pattern of how I operated in all my business dealings. The systematic way I gathered information about competitors, the targeted campaigns that weakened rival businesses, the network of contacts I used to influence market conditions in my favor. Practices that had seemed like aggressive but legal business tactics were being examined as potential fraud, market manipulation, and intentional interference with business relationships. Mike had been cooperating with investigators for 6 months, providing detailed information about how his business had been systematically undermined. But what made his testimony particularly damaging was that he had documentation, email trails, recorded conversations that showed how information about his financial situation had been leaked to parties who had no legitimate reason to know about it. Information that could only have come from sources connected to my organization. The net was closing around me faster than I had anticipated. But what I discovered next made me realize that my legal problems were the least of my concerns. The real threat to everything I had built was coming from inside my own organization, from people I had trusted with my darkest secrets and most ruthless strategies. My assistant, David, had been with me since the early days of Artisan, had helped me research my targets, had executed many of the campaigns that destroyed Jessica, Mike, and Amy. He knew about every illegal tactic, every unethical strategy, every piece of evidence that could connect me to the systematic destruction of their lives. And he had been documenting everything, creating an insurance policy that would protect him when my empire inevitably collapsed. The realization came when I found a USB drive hidden in my office safe, a drive that contained copies of every email, every recorded conversation, every piece of evidence that proved my involvement in destroying my former friends. David had been preparing for this moment for months, had been building a case against me while pretending to be my most loyal employee. The person I had trusted with my deepest secrets was planning to be the one who destroyed me. But what made David's betrayal even more devastating was learning why he had turned against me. It wasn't just about protecting himself or avoiding legal consequences. It was about his sister, Maria, a small business owner, whose artisan jewelry company had been one of the casualties of my expansion into Amy's market. When I had absorbed Amy's audience and business partnerships, I had destroyed dozens of small businesses that depended on her platform for visibility and sales. Maria's company was one of them. David had watched his sister's dreams die because of my revenge against someone she had never met, had seen her fall into the same desperate poverty I had once experienced, had helped her through the same kind of humiliation and despair that had once driven me to seek revenge. My actions had created a cycle of pain that reached far beyond my original targets, had hurt innocent people who had no connection to that night 3 years ago when my world had changed forever. Learning about Maria, understanding how my revenge had rippled out to damage people I had never even considered, broke something inside me that I didn't know could be broken. I had become the same kind of destroyer that I had once imagined my former friends to be, had inflicted on others the same pain I thought they had inflicted on me. The cycle of hurt was continuing, spreading, creating new victims who would someday seek their own revenge. But David wasn't planning to expose me out of simple justice or brotherly love. He was planning to use the evidence he had gathered to take over my empire, to position himself as the solution to the problems I had created while absorbing all the assets and relationships I had built. His betrayal wasn't just about stopping me, it was about replacing me, becoming the next person in the chain of people who built success on other people's suffering. The confrontation happened in my office on a Friday evening, when I thought I was alone in the building, David walked in with a folder full of evidence and a smile that reminded me of my own expression when I had been planning my revenge 3 years earlier. He had learned from watching me that power came from understanding people's weaknesses and being willing to exploit them without mercy. I had created a monster in my own image, and now that monster was coming for me. He offered me the same choice Amy had given me, but with a twist that made it clear he had learned well from my example. I could resign from all my companies, transfer my ownership stakes to him, and disappear quietly with enough money to live comfortably, but not enough to rebuild my empire. Or he could release the evidence to investigators, journalists, and business partners simultaneously, destroying not just my reputation but my freedom as the legal system tore apart everything I had built. But unlike Amy's offer, which had come from a place of genuine concern for my well-being, David's ultimatum was purely transactional. He didn't care about the innocent people who had been hurt by my actions, didn't want to help rebuild the lives I had destroyed. He just wanted to take my place as the person with the power to destroy others, wanted to inherit the empire I had built on cruelty and revenge. Sitting in my office, listening to David explain how thoroughly he had documented my crimes, I realized that this was always how the story was going to end. The systems I had created for destroying others had attracted people who were willing to use those same systems against me. The empire I had built on revenge was always going to be conquered by someone more ruthless, more prepared, more willing to sacrifice everything for power. But what I didn't know yet, what would only become clear in the days that followed, was that David wasn't the only person who had been preparing for my downfall. The investigation into my business practices had uncovered connections I had forgotten about, victims I had never considered, consequences that reached far beyond the 3 people I had originally targeted. My empire was about to collapse, not because of one betrayal, but because of dozens of them. Not because of one victim seeking justice, but because of a network of people who had been damaged by my success and were finally ready to fight back. The laughter that had started this whole cycle of revenge was about to be replaced by something much more dangerous: the silence of people who had learned to plan their own destruction of someone they had once feared. The next morning, I woke up to discover that David had been more thorough than I had imagined possible. My business accounts were frozen, my access to company systems had been revoked, and a federal investigation had been opened into my business practices. He hadn't waited for my response to his ultimatum, had instead moved immediately to implement his takeover while positioning himself as a whistleblower who was heroically exposing corporate malfeasance. But what I learned over the following days was that David's betrayal was just the visible tip of a much larger conspiracy, a network of people I had damaged who had been quietly preparing for this moment for months. Every person whose life I had touched during my rise to power, every business I had destroyed, every career I had ended, they had been talking to each other, sharing information, building a case that would ensure my complete destruction. The investigation wasn't just looking at Jessica, Mike, and Amy anymore. It was examining dozens of businesses that had failed after competing with my companies, hundreds of individuals whose careers had been damaged by my aggressive expansion, thousands of people who had been affected by the ripple effects of my systematic cruelty. What I had thought was targeted revenge against 3 people had actually been a pattern of behavior that had created an army of enemies. Maria, David's sister, had become the unofficial coordinator of this network. Her jewelry business had been destroyed when I absorbed Amy's platform. But instead of falling into despair like I had expected, she had started reaching out to other victims of my success. She had created a support group that became an information-sharing network that became a coordinated effort to document and expose my illegal business practices. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming. Tax evasion through shell companies I had forgotten about, fraud in how I had represented my revenue to investors, market manipulation through coordinated campaigns to destroy competitors, bribery of officials to get favorable treatment for my businesses, criminal conspiracy in how I had systematically targeted individuals for destruction. Each charge carried serious prison time, and together they painted a picture of someone who had built an empire through consistent criminality. But what made their case particularly devastating was that they had inside information from people who had worked for me, had done business with me, had been part of my network of contacts and collaborators. People I had trusted with sensitive information had been documenting my confessions, recording our conversations, saving evidence of my instructions to destroy competitors and target individuals for personal revenge. The media coverage began 3 days after David's betrayal, with a coordinated release of information to business journals, local newspapers, and online publications. The headlines were brutal: local business empire built on fraud and revenge, how one woman's success story became a criminal conspiracy, the dark side of entrepreneurship, when ambition becomes sociopathy. Each article included interviews with my victims, detailed breakdowns of my illegal tactics, and analysis of how someone could build such apparent success while causing so much damage to innocent people. The story was compelling not just because of the criminality, but because of the human cost. The lives destroyed by someone who claimed to be helping local businesses while actually preying on them. Reading those articles, seeing my story told from the perspective of my victims, I finally understood what I had actually become. Not a successful entrepreneur who had overcome adversity, but a predator who had used other people's trust and vulnerability to build wealth and power. The girl who had once wanted to help artisans connect with customers had become someone who destroyed artisans to feed her own ego and greed. My luxury apartment was raided by federal agents on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after David's betrayal. They seized computers, documents, phones, financial records, anything that might contain evidence of my criminal activities. Watching them catalog and remove everything I had accumulated during my rise to power, I realized that none of it had ever really belonged to me. It was all evidence of crimes, trophies taken from victims, symbols of a success that had been built on lies and cruelty. The arraignment was a media circus. Photographers and journalists filled the courthouse, documenting my transformation from successful businesswoman to criminal defendant. The charges were read aloud in a voice that made each one sound like a moral judgment: fraud, conspiracy, tax evasion, criminal interference with business relationships, racketeering. The prosecution requested that I be held without bail, arguing that I was a flight risk with extensive financial resources and a history of destroying anyone who opposed me. But what broke me completely during that hearing wasn't the charges or the media attention or even the prospect of spending decades in prison. It was seeing Jessica, Mike, and Amy in the courtroom, sitting together in the front row, watching my humiliation with expressions that showed not satisfaction or revenge, but genuine sadness for what I had become. They weren't there to gloat or celebrate my downfall. They were there to witness the end of a story that had started with their concern for my well-being and had ended with my complete destruction of everything good in my life and theirs. They were there to mourn the person I could have been if I had been capable of accepting help instead of choosing revenge. Sitting in that jail cell after the arraignment, waiting for my lawyer to arrange bail that might never come, I finally understood what Amy had been trying to tell me in our last conversation. Revenge doesn't heal wounds, it just creates new ones. Success built on other people's suffering isn't really success at all. It's just a more sophisticated form of failure, and the person you become in pursuit of proving others wrong might be someone you can't live with once you've proven your point. But understanding the truth about what I had done, accepting responsibility for the pain I had caused, that was just the beginning of a reckoning that would force me to confront not just my crimes, but the fundamental emptiness that had driven me to commit them in the first place. The girl who had once dreamed of being someone was finally going to discover who she really was. And the answer would be more terrifying than anything she had ever imagined. The bail hearing took place 3 days later, and what I learned during those proceedings shattered any remaining illusions I had about controlling my own narrative or managing the consequences of my actions. The prosecution had evidence I didn't even know existed, connections between my businesses and criminal activities that reached back to the very beginning of my empire. They revealed that Artisan Connect, the platform I had created to prove my worth, had been used to launder money through fake transactions with shell companies I had set up to hide my illegal activities. The consulting business that had made me rich had been systematically overcharging clients while providing services that were actually being performed by unpaid interns, and stolen intellectual property. My investment fund had been operating as a Ponzi scheme, using new investors' money to pay returns to earlier investors, while siphoning off millions for my personal use. Each revelation was worse than the last. painting a picture of someone who had been committing crimes almost from the moment I started building my empire. What I had thought was aggressive but legal business tactics had actually been systematic criminality that had defrauded investors, cheated clients, and stolen from the artisan community I claimed to be helping. But the most devastating evidence came from recordings made by Maria, David's sister, during the support group meetings she had organized for my victims. These weren't just business owners complaining about competition. They were people whose lives had been systematically destroyed by someone who had targeted them for personal reasons or financial gain. There was Elena, an elderly woman whose handmade soap business had been destroyed when I flooded the market with cheap knockoffs produced by a factory I secretly owned. She had lost her home, her savings, and her health trying to compete with products that were being sold below cost, specifically to drive her out of business. She was now living with her daughter and working part-time at a grocery store at 73 years old. There was Marcus, a young father whose woodworking business had collapsed after I arranged for his largest client to cancel their contract based on false information about his reliability. He had been forced to declare bankruptcy, had lost custody of his children when he couldn't afford child support, and was now homeless and struggling with addiction to cope with the depression of losing everything he had worked for. There was Carmen, a graphic designer whose client base had been systematically stolen when I hired people to pose as dissatisfied customers and spread negative reviews about her work across social media platforms. She had attempted suicide twice, had been hospitalized for severe anxiety, and was now unable to work in her field because the false reputation I had created for her made it impossible to find clients. The recordings of these support group meetings, played in open court, were like listening to a catalog of my sins read aloud by the people I had sinned against. Each story was different, but they all followed the same pattern. Someone whose life had been destroyed by my deliberate actions. Someone who had lost everything because I wanted more power, more money, more proof that I was someone worth respecting. Hearing their voices, understanding the full scope of what my empire had cost in human suffering, I finally grasped the true magnitude of what I had become. I wasn't just someone who had taken revenge too far or made some questionable business decisions. I was someone who had systematically destroyed innocent lives for profit and ego. Someone who had built success on a foundation of other people's misery. The judge denied bail, stating that I represented a clear danger to the community and had demonstrated a pattern of targeting individuals for destruction when they opposed my interests. I would remain in custody until trial, which was scheduled to begin in 6 months. 6 months to sit in a cell and think about what I had done, what I had become, and whether there was any way to make amends for the damage I had caused. But what I discovered during my first week in jail was that my legal problems were only part of my punishment. The other inmates knew who I was, had read about my case in the news, and they had their own opinions about someone who had gotten rich by destroying small businesses and ruining working people's lives. Prison has its own justice system, and someone like me was not going to be treated gently. The attacks started small: food stolen from my tray, personal items taken from my cell, accidents in the shower that left me bruised and humiliated. But they escalated quickly when the other inmates learned more details about my victims, particularly the elderly and the families with children whose lives I had destroyed for financial gain. Sarah Martinez, a woman serving time for drug dealing, who had lost her own small restaurant to gentrification and predatory business practices, made it clear that my presence in their facility was not welcome. She and her friends had decided that someone who had destroyed people's livelihoods deserved to experience the same fear and helplessness that my victims had felt when their worlds collapsed. The beatings were systematic and brutal, designed to inflict maximum pain while avoiding injuries that would require medical attention or trigger an investigation. They wanted me to suffer, to understand what it felt like to be powerless, to experience the same desperation and fear that I had inflicted on others. They wanted me to know that there were consequences for the kind of person I had chosen to become. But what made the violence even more devastating was that I knew I deserved it. Every punch, every threat, every moment of terror was payment for what I had done to innocent people who had trusted me or simply gotten in my way. The physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological weight of knowing that I had earned every moment of suffering through my own choices and actions. My lawyer visited me after 2 weeks in custody, and what he told me about the strength of the prosecution's case made it clear that accepting a plea deal might be my only option for avoiding life in prison. The evidence against me was overwhelming, the victims were sympathetic, and the media coverage had turned me into a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked capitalism and entrepreneurial greed. But the plea deal being offered was hardly merciful. 25 years in federal prison, in exchange for cooperating with ongoing investigations into business fraud and organized crime connections that had emerged during the examination of my empire. 25 years to think about what I had done, to live with the knowledge that I had destroyed dozens of lives for the sake of proving a point about my own worth. Sitting in that jail cell, broken and beaten, and facing the prospect of spending the next quarter-century in prison, I finally understood what Amy had been trying to tell me about the true cost of revenge. I had proven that I was someone, but the someone I had proven myself to be was a monster that no decent person could respect or love. The girl who had once dreamed of helping artisans connect with customers was gone, replaced by someone who had systematically destroyed the artisan community for personal gain. And now that someone was going to spend the rest of her life paying for what she had chosen to become. The plea hearing was scheduled for 2 months later, but before I could even consider accepting the deal, something happened that forced me to confront the final and most devastating consequence of my actions. A consequence that made all my legal troubles seem insignificant by comparison, and revealed the true depth of the hell I had created for myself and everyone around me. Amy visited me in jail on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after my arrest. She looked healthier than she had during our last meeting, stronger and more at peace, like someone who had finally found closure after a long struggle with trauma and loss. But what she had come to tell me would destroy any hope I had of finding similar peace, would force me to understand that some actions create damage so fundamental that no amount of punishment or remorse can ever make them right. She told me about her daughter, Emma, who was now 8 years old and had been living with Amy's parents since Amy's hospitalization following the collapse of her business and platform. Emma had been asking questions about why Mommy had been so sad, why their life had changed so dramatically, why they had lost their house and moved in with Grandma and Grandpa. Amy had been trying to protect her daughter from the truth, but children see more than adults realize, and Emma had been blaming herself for her mother's pain. The child psychologist Amy had been working with had explained that Emma was showing signs of severe anxiety and depression, was having nightmares about abandonment, was terrified that something she had done had caused her mother's breakdown. At 8 years old, she was carrying guilt and fear that belonged to me, suffering consequences for actions she couldn't possibly understand, paying a price for my revenge that she had never deserved. But what made Emma's situation even more heartbreaking was what Amy told me about the long-term effects of my destruction of her platform and audience. The business I had destroyed hadn't just been Amy's career. It had been her daughter's college fund, her family's health insurance, their stability and security and hope for the future. Emma would grow up in poverty because of my actions, would face limitations and struggles that I had directly caused through my systematic destruction of her mother's livelihood. Learning about Emma, understanding how my revenge had reached down to damage an innocent child who had no connection to that night 3 years ago when my world had changed, broke something inside me that I knew would never heal. I had become someone who destroyed children's futures for the sake of my own ego, someone whose actions had created suffering that would last for generations. Amy wasn't telling me this to be cruel or to add to my guilt. She was telling me because she wanted me to understand the full scope of what my choices had cost, wanted me to see that my actions had consequences that reached far beyond the immediate targets of my revenge. She wanted me to carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my life, to understand that some wounds can never be healed and some damage can never be undone. But she also had a proposal, something she had been thinking about during the months since my arrest, a way for me to begin making amends for the damage I had caused. She wanted me to establish a fund for the victims of my business practices, using whatever assets I had left to provide support for the people whose lives I had destroyed. It wouldn't undo the damage, wouldn't bring back lost businesses or restore destroyed careers, but it might help some of them rebuild and move forward. The logistics were complicated, because most of my assets were frozen pending the outcome of my criminal case, But Amy had been working with lawyers and victim advocates to create a framework that could operate even while I was in prison. The fund would be administered by trustees chosen by the victims themselves, would prioritize families with children and elderly victims who had lost their retirement savings, would focus on practical support rather than symbolic gestures. Agreeing to establish the fund meant giving up any claim to the wealth I had accumulated during my rise to power, meant accepting that I would spend the rest of my life in poverty as well as prison. But sitting in that jail cell, looking at Amy's face as she told me about her daughter's nightmares and anxiety, I realized that keeping my money would be another form of cruelty, another way of prioritizing my own interests over the well-being of the people I had damaged. Agreeing to establish the fund meant giving up any claim to the wealth I had accumulated during my rise to power, meant accepting that I would spend the rest of my life in poverty as well as prison. But sitting in that jail cell, looking at Amy's face as she told me about her daughter's nightmares and anxiety, I realized that keeping my money would be another form of cruelty, another way of prioritizing my own interests over the well-being of the people I had damaged. The paperwork was completed 3 weeks later, transferring control of my remaining assets to the Victim Compensation Fund, $12 million that would be distributed to the dozens of people whose lives I had destroyed, money that represented the liquidation of everything I had built during my transformation from waitress to criminal mastermind. It felt like the final death of the person I had tried to become, the last surrender of the empire I had built on other people's suffering. But what I discovered after establishing the fund was that giving away my wealth didn't bring the peace or redemption I had hoped for. If anything, it made the weight of my actions feel heavier, because it forced me to confront how inadequate any gesture of repentance would be compared to the magnitude of what I had done. $12 million couldn't give Alina back her soap business, or restore Marcus to his children, or heal Carmen's psychological trauma. It was a gesture, nothing more. A drop of water on a fire that would burn forever. The victim impact statements began arriving 2 weeks before my sentencing hearing. Letters from the people whose lives I had destroyed, telling the court about the ongoing effects of my actions on their families, their health, their ability to trust other people or pursue their dreams. Each letter was like a dagger to whatever was left of my soul, a reminder of the specific human cost of my systematic cruelty. Alina wrote about the arthritis in her hands that had gotten worse after she lost her business and could no longer afford medical care, about the shame of having to ask her daughter for money at 73 years old, about the depression that had settled over her life like a permanent shadow. Marcus wrote about the custody battle he was still fighting, about the addiction he had developed to cope with losing his children, about the way homelessness had broken his spirit and made him feel like less than human. Carmen wrote about the panic attacks that made it impossible for her to take on new clients, about the way my false reviews had destroyed not just her business but her confidence in her own abilities, about the medication she now needed just to function day to day. Each letter contained details about ongoing suffering, about damage that would last for years or decades, about lives that had been permanently altered by my choices. Reading those letters, understanding the continuing impact of what I had done, I finally grasped the true meaning of the phrase, "They're not laughing now." It wasn't that I had succeeded in making them respect me or fear me or acknowledge my worth. It was that I had turned laughter into tears, joy into suffering, hope into despair. I had proven that I was someone, but the someone I had proven myself to be was a destroyer of other people's happiness. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I knew that whatever punishment the judge imposed would be insignificant compared to the life sentence I had already given myself. The knowledge that I had become someone whose existence made the world a worse place, someone whose success had been built on the systematic destruction of innocent people's dreams and lives. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold Tuesday morning in February, almost exactly 4 years after that night when they had laughed at my business idea and set this entire catastrophe in motion. The courtroom was packed with my victims, their families, reporters, and legal observers who had been following what the media had dubbed the revenge entrepreneur case. Judge Patricia Williams had a reputation for harsh sentences in white-collar crime cases, particularly when the defendants had targeted vulnerable populations or caused widespread harm to their communities. As she reviewed the victim impact statements and the prosecution's sentencing recommendation, I could see in her expression that she understood the full scope of what I had done and was prepared to ensure that my punishment reflected the magnitude of my crimes. But before she announced my sentence, something unexpected happened that would change my understanding of this entire story one final time. Amy stood up in the gallery and asked permission to address the court, not as a victim impact statement that had already been submitted, but as someone who had discovered new information about my case that the court needed to hear. What Amy revealed in that moment shattered every assumption I had made about the investigation, the evidence against me, and the coordinated effort that had brought me to justice. She told the court that she had been working undercover with federal investigators for over a year, had been documenting my criminal activities and gathering evidence while pretending to be a broken victim, seeking closure and reconciliation. The support group meetings that Maria had organized, the network of victims who had coordinated their evidence, the insider information that had exposed my business practices, it had all been orchestrated by a joint task force investigating organized crime connections in local business communities. Amy had been their primary asset, using her genuine victimization as cover for an investigation that had uncovered criminal networks far beyond just my individual actions. My case wasn't just about one person's revenge gone wrong. It was part of a larger investigation into how organized crime had been infiltrating legitimate businesses, using entrepreneurs like me as fronts for money laundering, fraud, and systematic economic predation. The connections they had discovered between my businesses and criminal organizations reached back to some of my earliest investors and business partners, people I had thought were simply successful entrepreneurs who were impressed by my rapid growth. The revelation explained why the evidence against me had been so comprehensive, why the investigation had moved so quickly, why federal resources had been dedicated to what seemed like a local business fraud case. I hadn't just been building a criminal empire on my own. I had been recruited and supported by people who recognized my ruthlessness and lack of moral constraints as useful qualities for their operations. David's betrayal hadn't been a spontaneous decision by a disgruntled employee. He had been working with investigators from the beginning, had been documenting my activities as part of a larger investigation into the criminal network that had been using my businesses to launder money and commit fraud. His sister Maria's jewelry business had been destroyed not just by my actions, but by the criminal organization that had been backing my expansion into new markets. Learning this truth felt like being hit by lightning while drowning in an ocean of my own making. I had thought I was a brilliant criminal mastermind who had built an empire through my own cunning and ruthlessness. In reality, I had been a useful idiot, a front person for criminal organizations who had recognized my psychology and manipulated me into becoming their perfect asset, someone who would commit crimes enthusiastically while believing she was just being aggressive entrepreneur. The judge's sentence reflected this new understanding of my case. 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, followed by lifetime probation and permanent restitution obligations that would ensure I never accumulated significant wealth again. But more than the legal punishment, she wanted me to understand that I had been used, that my quest for revenge and recognition had made me an easy target for manipulation by people who were far more sophisticated criminals than I had ever imagined myself to be. The organized crime connections explained why my rise had been so meteoric, why doors had opened for me so easily, why investors had been willing to back an inexperienced entrepreneur with limited credentials. It wasn't that I was particularly talented or persuasive, it was that I was being supported by people who had specific uses for my businesses and my willingness to destroy anyone who got in my way. But understanding that I had been manipulated didn't absolve me of responsibility for my choices. I had still chosen to destroy innocent people's lives, had still prioritized my own ego over basic human decency, had still turned my pain into a weapon that I used against people who didn't deserve to suffer. Being used by criminals didn't make me less of a criminal, it just made me a more pathetic one. Walking back to my cell after the sentencing, I finally understood what had actually happened during this entire story. I had started as someone who was wounded by a misunderstanding, had been recruited and manipulated by criminals who recognized my psychological vulnerabilities, had been used as a front for illegal activities while believing I was building my own empire, and had ultimately been discarded when my usefulness was exhausted and my criminal activities had attracted too much attention. The girl who had once dreamed of helping artisans connect with customers had become a pawn in other people's criminal schemes, had been used and discarded like a piece of equipment that had served its purpose and become a liability. My quest to prove that I was someone had ended with the discovery that I was nobody, just another victim of manipulation who had been turned into a weapon against her own community. But what made this revelation even more devastating was realizing that Amy, Jessica, and Mike had figured out what was happening to me long before I had understood it myself. Their initial concern about my emotional state, their worry about how I would handle the challenges of entrepreneurship, their attempts to offer help and support, they had been trying to protect me from exactly the kind of exploitation and manipulation that had ultimately destroyed my life. They had seen that I was vulnerable, had recognized that my desperation and pain made me a target for people who would use those emotions against me, had tried to create a support network that would help me build genuine success instead of the hollow, criminal empire that I had been manipulated into creating. Their laughter that night hadn't been mockery, it had been the last moment of innocent joy before they watched someone they cared about disappear into a hell of manipulation and revenge. Now they truly weren't laughing, not because they feared me or respected my success, but because they were mourning the person I could have been if I had been able to accept help instead of choosing revenge. They were grieving for the friend they had tried to save, who had been too wounded and too proud to recognize that salvation when it was offered. Prison became my monastery, the place where I finally had the time and isolation necessary to understand the full scope of what I had become and what I had lost during my transformation from dreamer to destroyer. The daily routine of incarceration, the forced simplicity of life without choices or luxury or control, created a space for reflection that I had never allowed myself during my years of building and maintaining my criminal empire. The other inmates' hostility had evolved into something more complex over the months since my arrival. Some still saw me as a symbol of the predatory capitalism that had destroyed their communities and families, but others had begun to recognize that I was as much a victim of the system as anyone else, just a victim who had been turned into a weapon against her own people. The conversations that developed in that environment taught me more about the real nature of crime and punishment than any courtroom proceeding ever could. Maria Gonzalez, who was serving time for embezzlement from the nonprofit where she had worked, had stolen money to pay for her daughter's cancer treatment when their insurance was denied. She helped me understand that most crime comes from desperation, from people who are backed into corners by systems that prioritize profit over human welfare, who make terrible choices because all their alternatives seem worse. Janet Williams, who was serving time for running a prescription drug ring, had started selling pills to pay for her mother's nursing home care when Social Security wasn't enough to cover the costs. She taught me that the line between victim and criminal is often thinner than people want to admit. That circumstance and manipulation can turn anyone into someone they never thought they could become. These women had committed crimes that hurt people, had made choices that damaged their communities, but they had done so from positions of genuine desperation rather than from the kind of entitled rage that had motivated my actions. Learning their stories forced me to acknowledge that while I had been manipulated and used, I had also been privileged in ways that made my choices more inexcusable than theirs. The therapy sessions that were mandatory for all inmates with mental health issues became the place where I finally began to understand the psychological mechanics of what had happened to me. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist who worked with white-collar criminals, helped me trace the path from wounded pride to criminal mastermind, from legitimate business ambition to systematic predation of my own community. She explained that people like me, people with deep wounds around respect and recognition, are particularly vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations because we are willing to do anything to prove our worth. Our desperate need for validation makes us perfect assets for people who understand how to manipulate shame and ambition into criminal behavior. We become weapons that are aimed at targets chosen by others, while believing we are pursuing our own goals and settling our own scores. But Dr. Chen also helped me understand that being manipulated doesn't erase moral responsibility. It just explains how someone can make choices that seem incomprehensible from the outside. I had still chosen to destroy innocent people's lives, had still prioritized my own emotional needs over basic human decency, had still turned my pain into a tool for creating more pain in the world. The Victims Fund that Amy had helped me establish began distributing money 18 months into my sentence, and the reports I received about how that money was being used became both a source of hope and a reminder of the inadequacy of any attempt at restitution. Elena had been able to afford medical care for her arthritis and had started a small garden that brought her some peace, but she would never recover the business or the independence that I had taken from her. Marcus had been able to enter a residential treatment program for his addiction and was slowly rebuilding his relationship with his children. But the years of homelessness and despair had left scars that would never fully heal. Carmen had used her portion of the fund to start therapy and was beginning to take on small design projects again. But she would never trust the business world the way she had before. I destroyed her reputation and confidence. Each success story from the fund was shadowed by the knowledge that no amount of money could truly undo what I had done, could restore the lives I had shattered or heal the trauma I had inflicted. The fund was a gesture toward justice, but justice itself remained elusive, something that existed more as an aspiration than as an achievable goal. Amy visited me regularly during my first 2 years in prison, not out of friendship or forgiveness, but because she understood that isolation and despair could turn me into an even more dangerous person when I was eventually released. Her visits were part of her work with the Victim Services Organization. She now ran part of a broader effort to interrupt cycles of revenge and manipulation that created new criminals from old victims. During one of these visits, she told me about Emma, who was now 10 years old and thriving in school despite the trauma of her early childhood. Emma had started a small business making friendship bracelets and donating the profits to a local animal shelter, showing the kind of entrepreneurial spirit and community focus that I had once possessed before my wounds and manipulation had turned those qualities into tools of destruction. Learning about Emma's healthy approach to business and success was both inspiring and heartbreaking. A reminder of what I could have become if I had been able to channel my ambition and determination in positive directions instead of allowing them to be corrupted by revenge and criminal influence. Emma represented the path not taken, the person I might have been if I had accepted help instead of choosing isolation and rage. The letter I wrote to Emma on her 10th birthday was never sent, but writing it became an important part of my ongoing attempts to understand and take responsibility for what I had done. I tried to explain to this child whose life I had damaged why her mother's friend had made such terrible choices, why sometimes good people do bad things, why it's important to ask for help when you're hurting instead of trying to handle everything alone. But most importantly, I tried to apologize not just for the specific ways my actions had affected her family, but for the broader damage I had done to the world she was inheriting. I had made her community less safe, less trusting, less willing to take risks on new entrepreneurs or support local businesses. I had contributed to a culture of cynicism and suspicion that would make it harder for the next generation of dreamers to find the support and encouragement they needed to build something positive. Writing that letter forced me to acknowledge that my story wasn't just about personal failure or individual redemption. It was about the way wounded people can become infectious, spreading their pain and distrust throughout their communities, creating environments where more people get hurt and fewer people are willing to take the risks necessary for genuine success and positive change. The transformation I had undergone in prison was as complete as the transformation that had turned me from waitress to criminal. But this time the change was toward something more human rather than less. I was learning to feel empathy without expecting it to be reciprocated, to take responsibility without demanding forgiveness, to understand my place in larger systems of harm and healing without making myself the center of the story. But I was also learning that some transformations come too late, that some damage can't be undone no matter how sincere your remorse or how complete your rehabilitation. The person I was becoming in prison might be worthy of respect, but she would never be able to undo what the person I had been had chosen to do to innocent people who deserved protection rather than predation. 27 years have passed since that night when they laughed at my dreams. And I'm writing this from a halfway house, where I'm spending the final months of my sentence before my release, into a world that has changed in ways I could never have imagined. The internet has transformed business and society, but the fundamental human dynamics of ambition, revenge, and redemption remain as relevant as ever. The woman who will walk out of here in 3 months is not the same person who walked into prison 30 years ago, but she carries all the memories and responsibilities of what that person did during her brief destructive reign as a criminal entrepreneur. I have learned to live with those memories, to carry that responsibility without being crushed by it. But I will never be free of the knowledge that my choices created suffering that echoes through time in ways I'm still discovering. Emma is now 37 years old, a successful social worker who specializes in helping children whose families have been affected by white-collar crime. She has built a life dedicated to healing the kinds of wounds I once inflicted, has turned her childhood trauma into a source of strength and purpose that helps other families navigate similar challenges. Her work is part of my legacy, a positive outcome that grew from the ashes of my destructive choices. Amy died 6 years ago from cancer, but she spent her final years building a network of support services for entrepreneurs who are struggling with mental health issues, financial stress, and the kind of vulnerability that makes them targets for exploitation by criminal organizations. Her death was peaceful, surrounded by the community she had rebuilt after I destroyed her first attempt at business success. Jessica rebuilt her marketing career by focusing on ethical business practices and authentic brand development, becoming a consultant who helps companies build genuine connections with their communities, rather than manipulating consumer behavior for profit. Her work directly contradicts everything I once represented, but she has never publicly connected her career focus to her experience as one of my victims. Mike never rebuilt his real estate empire, but he became a counselor who works with men who have lost their businesses and identities to failed entrepreneurial ventures. His own experience of losing everything made him uniquely qualified to help others navigate the psychological challenges of business failure and the depression that often follows the collapse of someone's professional dreams. The Victims Fund continued operating long after my assets were distributed, growing into a nonprofit organization that provides support for people who have been targeted by predatory business practices. The fund has helped hundreds of families rebuild their lives, has provided seed money for legitimate entrepreneurs who are committed to ethical business practices, and has become a model for how communities can protect themselves from the kind of systematic exploitation that I once represented. But the most important thing I've learned during these decades of imprisonment and reflection is that success and failure are not opposites. They are different points on the same spectrum of human experience. The laughter that wounded me so deeply 30 years ago was not a judgment about my worth as a person. It was a moment of human connection that I was too wounded to recognize and too proud to accept. The real tragedy of my story is not that I failed to build a legitimate business empire, but that I succeeded in building an illegitimate one. I proved that I could be someone, but the someone I chose to become was a person who made the world worse, rather than better, who took more than # part 7 the next morning. I woke up to discover that David had been more thorough than I had imagined possible. My business accounts were frozen, my access to company systems had been revoked, and a federal investigation had been opened into my business practices. He hadn't waited for my response to his ultimatum, had instead moved immediately to implement his takeover, while positioning himself as a whistleblower who was heroically exposing corporate malfeasance. But what I learned over the following days was that David's betrayal was just the visible tip of a much larger conspiracy, a network of people I had damaged who had been quietly preparing for this moment for months. Every person whose life I had touched during my rise to power, every business I had destroyed, every career I had ended, they had been talking to each other, sharing information, building a case that would ensure my complete destruction. The investigation wasn't just looking at Jessica, Mike, and Amy anymore. It was examining dozens of businesses that had failed after competing with my companies, hundreds of individuals whose careers had been damaged by my aggressive expansion, thousands of people who had been affected by the ripple effects of my systematic cruelty. What I had thought was targeted revenge against they laughed when I said I'd be someone. They're not laughing now.